Whatever happened to civics class in American high schools? I heard it doesn't exist anymore. To me, a class about the rights and duties of citizens is something important everyone needs to know, especially considering 40% of American college students don't know that so-called hate speech is protected under the Constitution. And even fewer know why it's protected speech, which is what I want to get into a little bit now. But first let me say, it doesn't even make sense to think that the First Amendment only applies to popular or unoffensive speech. Popular and unoffensive speech doesn't need protection. And the Supreme Court explained this plenty of times by confirming that speech which causes only emotional injury is protected no matter how offensive it is. For example, in one case, the father of a military veteran sued the Westboro Baptist Church for emotional distress after church members picketed his son's funeral with hateful anti-gay signs. The Supreme Court found that the First Amendment protected the picketing. The Bill of Rights is a brilliant document designed for the notion that people can govern themselves. It's a list of negative rights, a list of specific prohibitions on governmental power that ensures basic human rights. And freedom of expression is first on that list because it reinforces all other human rights. I wonder how many leftists who think that enacting hate speech laws is a good idea know that in the 1960s some state governments tried to criminalize the civil rights movement by saying the teachings of people like MLK and Malcolm X was hate speech and would lead to a race war. But the court held that state governments cannot outlaw hateful speech, even speech advocating violent revolution. And once you open the door to criminalizing some offensive speech, then you don't have freedom of speech at all. I mean, if you think you can criminalize some speech that is offensive and still have freedom of speech, then Russians under Stalin had freedom of speech. Because under Stalin, they could still say what they wanted to say, just not things that offended the state. Now, a recent comment on one of my videos shows how that concept is lost on some people, especially Europeans. He wrote, "The EU is not a dictatorship. We have as many rights for free speech as the US does." No, sorry, that's wrong. In France, 83-year-old Hollywood icon Brigitte Bardot has been on trial and convicted 5 times for expressing her opinion about France's immigration policies. The last time the charge was inciting ethnic hatred, and she was fined the equivalent of $24,000 and given a suspended jail sentence. And I think it was for saying halal slaughter was barbaric. And I know once she was convicted for complaining about foreign overpopulation in a French newspaper, another time for complaining about the loss of French identity and tradition due to, quote, the multiplication of mosques while our church bells fall silent for want of priests, unquote. She was also convicted for comments in her book Pluto's Square, where in the chapter titled Open Letter to My Lost France, she wrote, "My country, France, my homeland, my land is again invaded by an overpopulation of foreigners, especially Muslims." And she's just one of hundreds of people convicted of wrong talk in France every year. And in Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, and other European countries, people are regularly jailed for tweets and Facebook posts that the government deems hateful. Even holding an unconventional view on World War II is jailable. London's Metropolitan Police has 900 full-time officers policing Facebook and Twitter to crack down on people posting hurty words, while the murder rate just surpassed New York City's for the first time in history. I also want to specifically mention Count Dankula, who was recently convicted for making a Nazi joke and uploading it to YouTube, because I noticed everyone who defended him, from Tommy Robinson to Sargon of Akkad, did so by saying it was just a joke, which it was, but I hope they get that it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter whether or not he was joking because offensive speech shouldn't be illegal in the first place. And you know, a government arresting someone for teaching their dog to do a Roman salute is just weird. An insane, dystopian, Orwellian kind of weird. Just so everyone knows I'm not a heartless and callous bastard, I get that someone who had relatives killed by the Nazis can be offended by Nazi jokes. But what about people who had relatives killed by the communists? Not only is speech propagating communism not considered hate speech, but leftists just erected a 2-ton, 20-foot-tall bronze statue of Karl Marx in the damn city center of Trier, Germany. And it's not like everyone's good with that. Dieter Dombrowski of the Victims of Communist Tyranny Union called the erection of the statue bizarre. I would have used a much harsher adjective. So anyway, it's clear that hateful speech is subjective, and that leads to an inherent problem with censoring speech. You have to trust censors, which you can't, because no one's infallible, especially if their motives are pure. Milton Friedman put it this way: the most harm of all is done when power is in the hands of people who are absolutely persuaded by the purity of their instincts and the purity of their intentions. And free speech isn't just about the ability to speak, but the ability to listen to other views. In 2015, at a United Nations luncheon, Angela Merkel was caught on a hot mic pressing Mark Zuckerberg about negative social media posts about the wave of Syrian refugees entering Germany. Zuckerberg responded by saying, "We need to do some work on that issue." Then Merkel asked, "Are you working on this?" Zuckerberg responded, "Yeah," before the transmission was disrupted. So restricting speech comes in many forms. Why aren't more Europeans that live in countries with open borders and run by leftists asking why their governments no longer collect crime data showing the ethnicity of the perpetrators? I wonder what it is about their crime statistics that they don't want people to know or talk about. So once the door is open to restricting speech and people accept it, censorship just snowballs. For example, in Western Europe, laws are being proposed to outlaw misogynistic speech, as well as speech offensive specifically to trans and gay people. Actually, in Sweden, Christian pastors have already been jailed for preaching that homosexuality is a sin, based on Sweden's 2002 hate speech statute, which explicitly includes church sermon as a subject to the law's restrictions. Now, I know someone's going to say, well, what about fundamental Islam? Shouldn't that speech be restricted? Well, if it's not incitement to where you're persuading someone to commit a crime, no. Besides, people should know exactly what the people being led into their country believe, so let them speak. Now, going back to that comment that European dude left, there's something important that he said that I didn't mention yet. He said that Europe is not a dictatorship, and he's right about that, but that means Europeans have no excuse for allowing their freedom to think and speak freely to be infringed. Since it's not a dictatorship, politicians can be voted out of office, policies changed, and laws repealed. So I offer a simple solution, a simple way for Europeans to regain their freedom of speech. Vote the leftists out and get the European right wing in. And if you're not in the know because of years of leftist conditioning, today's right wing are not yesterday's fascists. Mussolini defined fascism as everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. That's the opposite of what the right stands for. We don't want a big intrusive government, we want liberty. And the beauty of it is you don't have to convince the right-wing party leaders that freedom of speech is a basic human right and that anyone seeking to restrict speech only does so in the name of seeking further power over individuals against their will. They already know that. Just take a look at their party platforms or take a listen to some of their speeches.
Is genoeg. Vrienden, ik ben gevraagd om hier vanavond ook over de vrijheid van meningsuiting te spreken. En dat doe ik graag. Want islam en vrijheid gaan niet samen. En de vrijheid van meningsuiting heeft ook alles te doen met onze patriotistische lente. Ze is er eigenlijk de trigger van. Ze is ons belangrijkste wapen. En dat geven we natuurlijk niet af. De vrijheid van meningsuiting is de poortwachter van de democratie. Zij garandeert dat niet alleen de elite mag spreken, maar ook de gewone mensen. En wij zijn hier vanavond bij elkaar op een hele symbolische plek. We bevinden ons als het ware tussen hamer en aanbeeld. Geografisch zijn we nu in het midden tussen twee plaatsen die de grootste gevaren voor de vrijheid van meningsuiting en de democratie symboliseren. Aan de ene kant de islam en aan de andere kant het politiek correcte cultuurrelativisme. 3 kilometer hier vandaan, in het westen, ligt de Gazastrook van West-Europa. Het mekka van het Europese jihadisme. En u noemt dat Molenbeek. In Molenbeek In Molenbeek is inmiddels bijna 40% van de bevolking islamitisch. In Molenbeek zien we wat er met een mooi oud Vlaams dorp gebeurt als je de massa-immigratie vrij spel geeft en als je geen enkele eis stelt van assimilatie. De oorspronkelijke bevolking vlucht en de islam in de meest zwarte vorm komt ervoor in de plaats. Daar in Molenbeek werden de terreuraanvallen gepland die afgelopen november honderden onschuldige levens hebben gekost in Parijs. Net als de gruwelijke aanval op het Joods Museum hier in Brussel in 2014 en de mislukte aanslag op de Thalys tussen Amsterdam en Parijs vorig jaar in Molenbeek werden gepland. En aan de andere kant, ten oosten van ons, bevindt zich een ander groot gevaar. Het hoofdkwartier van de Europese Unie. Het monster dat alle naties van Europa van hun identiteit, van hun grenzen wil beroven. De Europese Unie, beste mensen, duwt ons de massa-immigratie, de asieltsunami en de islamisering door de strot. Ze maakt van heel Europa één gigantisch Molenbeek. En hier staan wij, u en ik, op deze plek tussen Molenbeek en de torens van Babel van de Europese Unie en het Schumannplein. Hier staan wij, de patriotten die opkomen voor ons land. En wij hebben eigenlijk maar één wapen. En dat is